Hello, and welcome to the Helen Diller Institute of Jewish Law and Israel Studies. You are joining us for a conversation with Bar-Ilan professor Elisheva Rosman-Stollman about her work on religion and gender in the Israeli military, including questions of gender, equality, religious accommodation, and the legitimation of religious female soldiers. Professor Ronit Stahl, professor of history at UC Berkeley, will be moderating. This discussion is part of a year-long virtual lunchtime series on civil society and plurality in Israel, showcasing recent scholarly work about critical social and political issues and movements in Israeli society. Earlier in the series, we heard Hebrew University law professor Michael Karyani speak about his new book, A Multicultural Entrapment, Religion and State Among the Palestinian Arabs in Israel, and Tel Aviv University political scientist Professor Amal Jamal on his new book, Reconstructing the Civic, Palestinian Civil Activism in Israel. We also heard a riveting conversation exploring Yofi Tirosh's work on sex segregation in Israeli society and the appropriate balance between religious accommodation and sex equality. If you missed these sessions, you can find the recording on our website, and the link to that website is going to appear in the chat right this minute. Today, we are honored to be joined by Elisheva Rosman-Stollman. Elisheva is an associate professor in the Political Studies Department at Bar-Ilan University. Her research focuses on civil-military relations in general and religio-military relations in particular, both in Israel and in international contexts. Her research interests include the media image of Israeli soldiers and religious soldiers in the IDF, soldiers in the civilian medical system, religious feminism, and marriage outside the rabbinate in Israel. She is the author of For God and Country, Religious Student Soldiers in the Israeli Defense Forces, and that was published by the University of Texas Press. And we are so pleased to welcome, as today's discussant, fellow Berkeley colleague, Professor Ronit Stahl. Ronit is an associate professor of history. Her work focuses on pluralism in American society by examining how politics, law, and religion interact in spaces such as the military and medicine. She's the author of Enlisting Faith, How the Military Chaplaincy Shaped Religion and State in Modern America, that was published by Harvard in 2017. Her current research examines the rise of institutional and corporate rights. We're so happy to have you both here virtually and look forward to a time soon when it will be easier to host you here in person. I'll also note that in the latter part of this discussion, our host and guest will draw on questions from the Q&A box, which is at the bottom of the screen. So please feel free to submit your audience questions into that little Q&A icon that appears on the bottom of your screen. So please join me in welcoming Elisheva and Ronit.
Thank you, Ron, for that wonderful introduction. And thank you to everyone who is joining us today. I'm thrilled to be part of this conversation. And I'm really excited for the opportunity to talk about gender and religion in the military with Elisheva. I think for me, the military has long been a really fascinating social institution that reveals a lot about the societies in which it's lodged. And so I'm hoping to start today. You know, a lot of people may have an image of the IDF or the Israeli Defense Forces in their head, and it's probably of a male soldier. But I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit, Elisheva, just about the composition of the Israeli military, who serves, and what does the military look like as an institution? Oh, I think you might have disappeared there for a moment, but I think you're back. So I just asked you to start things off. If you could just tell us a little bit about the IDF as an institution, as a social space, who's there, who serves, and how do they get there?
Thank you so much. Yeah, having it in a virtual space has its own problems. So, okay, so when we talk about the IDF, these are defense forces. We're talking about a conscription-based military, and these are growing more and more rare as the 21st century progresses. So let's go back a little bit to pre-state, pre-1948. I think that actually we can draw on what's going on in the Ukraine a little bit, because when we look at the defenders in the Ukraine now, we see older people, we see women, we see younger people that we wouldn't expect to see in uniform. So if we're talking about pre-1948 in Israel, these are the sort of soldiers that we would have seen, not typical. And that is sort of the tradition that began the IDF. You have older people that you wouldn't necessarily see in uniform, and you have a lot of women. And so you see women serving really in all the pre-IDF military organizations. 1948, and the IDF becomes a reality, and the Israeli parliament, the Knesset, begins to debate what are they going to do for manpower. It's actually, I think this is one of the very few examples where the Hebrew is better than the English, because I don't think you can say manpower in a better way, but in Hebrew it's really people power. So who are going to be the people who are going to be in the military? And for various reasons, it's decided that women are also going to be conscripted. So we're going to have young men and young women from the age of 18. The duration of service is going to change throughout the years, but in general, these are the people who are going to serve. And when you have conscription, that means that you're conscripting everyone: religious men, religious women, ultra-Orthodox men. Non-Jews are also conscripted from certain parts of Israeli society. So all of this is going to be problematic because you have different people coming from different places, and they're all going to be serving together. Today, when we talk about conscription, so we're still talking about men and women from the age of 18, but it's changed. So ultra-Orthodox men and women, of course, don't serve. Various groups of non-Jewish Israelis also do not serve, but some do. There's also the option of civilian national service, which we're not going to talk about today, but that's a whole other kettle of fish. Women serve for 24 months today, and men serve for 32 months. So there is a difference. However, there are certain roles in the Israeli military that if a woman wants to be in them, and some of these are considered combat roles, they have to sign on for 32 months as well. So there are certain spaces where it is more equal and other spaces where it is less equal. But I think if that's where we're trying to sort of set the stage, this is what we're talking about. Now, another important thing to state already is that there are many men and women who take, so it's not a gap year, but it's a year to study before they actually enlist. And there are different programs for religious young people and for non-religious young people. And there's a whole host of programs, pre-military programs, that I assume we'll also talk a little bit about. And young religious women from these programs also enlist. So that's sort of, I think.
Great. No, thank you. Thank you for setting the scene and giving us kind of a picture of what the IDF looks like, and particularly kind of this group of, relatively young men and women who are therefore in this space together, which has a purpose, or of course mission, and different roles then contribute in different ways, but it's also, of course, a social space. It means that there's people interacting with other people. And can you tell us a little bit just about that dynamic, and what, from the perspective of thinking about men and women in this space and the different roles they occupy, what are some of the issues that have emerged in Israel? And I say, as someone who studies the US military, the question of women, especially in the military, we both long had women, but never conscripted women in the United States, but also it's like a constant concern. There's always issues from, across a political spectrum of what happens when you have women in military spaces. So can you tell us on the Israeli side, what does this look like? What are some of the issues that are most present from, a variety of perspectives about women in this particular space?
Oh, wow, that's really very broad. I hope that you'll sort of, I don't know, help me out here and make sure that I'm on track. I think that to really start discussing how we look at these social interactions, so we have to differentiate between combat and non-combat roles. So women traditionally served in non-combat, or as they're usually termed, pink collar roles, roles that are fitted for women. And these are usually support roles, educational roles, instruction, tank instructors, mortar instructors, shooting instructors, and also what are more, I'd say, supportive in a social sense. So in the Israeli military, there's a post called a mashakitash, a non-commissioned officer who is in charge of making sure that everyone's home situation is not interfering with their military situation. Is there food in their fridge? Are their parents working? So this is generally a very feminine position, or an education and a non-commissioned officer who the Israeli military has a lot of social roles. And one of the social roles is to educate soldiers. So there are two sort of tracks. There's tracks for new immigrants who need help with their Hebrew. And Israel traditionally has had to help soldiers with their Hebrew. You can't send people to the front. Well, you can, but you shouldn't send soldiers to the front who can't understand what their officers are saying. And there's another track of those who haven't finished 8 years of school, 10 years of school, 12 years of school. And the idea is that when they finally are discharged, they will be able to go on even to higher education. And the military takes charge of helping out with education. And women have also traditionally taught in these tracks as well. So these are some of the more feminine roles that we are talking about. And most of them are not combat. In recent years, there have been more roles where women do serve in combat. And that's really, when you talk about the social aspects, that's one of the places where we're going to have to explore. The other thing that we should say about non-combat roles is that traditionally women have also served in two capacities that are more, where they're considered I'll go back. When you put women in an instruction role, you're basically saving men. So you're able to send men to the front because they're not doing instruction roles. So the women are sort of a secondary asset. Whereas in intelligence or in the medical corps, they're many times seen as a primary asset. You're not saving men. They're good enough. They can do the job just as well as the men can. So in intelligence and in the medical corps, you can see women doing the same roles as the men. And these are also sometimes considered very prestigious roles in intelligence, for instance. Men and women do exactly the same jobs. So you have both smart, bright men and women who are 18, 20, 21, serving together in very close capacity. And it's not combat. So these are sort of the two tracks that we're discussing. When we talk about combat, I think most people can sort of understand, even if we look at the American context, they can understand how difficult this may be. If you sit together in the same armed personnel carrier, or if you're part of the same tank crew, these can generate a lot of problems. And I assume that if you want me to go more in that direction, we can talk more about that.
Well, I think this is, yeah. Oh, sorry. Well, what I was going to say is, I think what's interesting to hear you talk about is, again, coming from the US context, we've had recurring fights over, what roles do women play? And in the US military, women started as primarily nurses, and then in the Signal Corps, which is probably the closest, in terms of communication, closest perhaps to kind of these roles in the medical corps as medics or as intelligence officers. And then, in more recent years, all sorts of fights over, women in combat that, depending on who's lodging the argument, can take on kind of some of it is about physical capabilities. People argue, well, can women, be pass the test, right? Are they as strong? Can they pull a man out of a situation? So, one is about a sort of capacity issue, but often that's used to get at other issues, which are really about like literally what happens when men and women are like in kind of these tense situations together. What about the sort of gender dynamics or the social roles of men and women in these spaces? Some people will lodge concerns about sexual harassment or just kind of sex in the military. What's going to happen here? So before we even get to kind of overt arguments about like from a religious perspective, there's kind of these like social role concerns. And I'm wondering just kind of what, as questions about women in combat in Israel have been raised, like what are the types of concerns people are raising?
So it's a lot like what you've just been saying. What will happen if women are taken prisoner of war? What will happen then? Are they physically able to do what they need to do? So recently there was the issue of training women for the tank corps. And there was a pilot that where basically what they saw was, well, actually, it's not so clear what the military found out, but how it was portrayed in public discourse was that the women weren't good enough, and that was one of the reasons why the military discontinued the pilot. Now, the important thing to remember is that because of the religious considerations, the idea was to make it an all-women tank. So you wouldn't have a mixed tank, but a tank that had an all-women crew. So one of the important roles in the tank is loading the cannon, and that requires being physically able to do so in a very short period of time. So they had a minimum weight and a minimum height requirement for the women who were in the pilot. It's important maybe to note that for men, if you take someone into a tank crew, there's no minimum weight or minimum height for a man, but there are for women. So maybe as an aside, we should say that from a military perspective, not all men are really good soldiers. There's no other way of saying it. It's very easy to say that women aren't good physically or aren't cut out physically to be soldiers, but there are plenty of men who make very bad soldiers. And when you conscript everyone, you're conscripting everyone. Not everyone can run and lift and load a cannon, even from the men. And when we look at the women and everyone is always making sure that can the women really meet the physical requirements, there are no such physical requirements, say in a tank. There are for other military roles. So one of the things that I think you see maybe more in the US military is that looking at women from the perspective of the right person in the right place at the right time. If you're able to do the required sit-ups, then you're going to be okay. And we all remember G.I. Jane. And so if you're strong enough, you should be able to do it. The Israeli considerations are different because, of course, we start moving into the religious sphere. But as you say, when we go into the religious sphere, it's not always that these considerations are really religious. Many times they are masquerading as religious considerations when actually they're cultural or even misogynist considerations concerning women. As far as combat is concerned, there's something else that we should note, and that is that when a woman signs on for combat or a combat role in the Israeli military, she signs on for a longer period of time. Say a woman wants to be a pilot or is able to be a pilot, and pilots, of course, all are required to pass certain tests. She'll have to sign on for a very long time, much longer than her friends who go, say, to the intelligence corps and have a very prestigious role, but they're going to have to serve a lot less. So if you are 18 and you're able to choose, what would you choose? Would you want to go into combat? The other thing to remember is that Israel also has a reserve corps. And once you are a combat soldier, you're going to be required to serve in the reserves. Is this something that you're going to want to do? Maybe you prefer to be a medic and serve less. Maybe you prefer, or medic isn't always a good, but maybe you're going to want to be a less prestigious role and be able to get back to your life as a civilian quicker. So these considerations also feature. Do we always want to be the poster girl? Do I want to fight for women's rights, or do I just want to be me? This also brings up the issue that for many of the roles, women have a choice and men don't have a choice. So again, if we're talking about equality and where women fit in conscription, if we're not giving choices and women have to do what men have to do, we're going to get a different sort of picture in the military. Whereas the fact that we're allowing them makes it more complicated.
That's no, it's a really good point. I was thinking as you were speaking that there have been, quite a few women in the U.S. who after their military service have run for office. Some of them are, serving in political office. A lot of them were fighter pilots or involved in training pilots, and it's an interest. So it's just, I was thinking as you raised that, like, the choices, right? For some women, that's like a really exciting opportunity. And for others, as you say, like maybe they'll do their service. It's a requirement, and then they'll move on. Whereas for others, there is the possibility that this is really like matching an interest they have.
Yeah. So take Tammy Duckworth, who is always a very good example. I think that she would fit in really well with the Israeli example, because in Israel as well, serving in the military is usually sort of allowing you to then later on run for office because you have the proper credential. It's much harder for a woman to run for office in Israel if you don't have some sort of military background or security background. And we have the example of Tzipi Livni, who had very strong security background, and therefore it was natural for her to run for office. And that's a very interesting story that we're really not going to cover today. But you're right that if you serve in the military, it gives you certain social capital that you're able to use. And in Israel, that's very important. On the other hand, as Israeli society moves to being more individualistic, and a lot of people think that perhaps it doesn't matter, and I could make it in the civilian world without a very strong security background. And it's not as important as it used to be. It used to be that you couldn't be someone important in Israeli public life without a very strong security background, which made it for women very, very difficult to break out. We're not going to get into this, but if you look at many of the important women who reached important places in the Israeli political sphere, they come from some security background. They served in the pre-state establishment and many other things as well. So today it's not as important as it was, but it is still important.
Thank you. Yeah. And, as we've kind of alluded to, in addition to kind of these broader, concerns just about women in this space that is often characterized or assumed to be male or masculine, there's also in Israel the religious concerns often expressed by at least some rabbis about like what happens when you have women in this space. I was really struck in you have a recent article about women, and I was really struck as these debates about women in combat roles. Just some of the quotes from some of the rabbis, where, for example, the chief rabbi of Sfad saying, in the real military that needs to fight, it's a shame to invest in girls and station them in tanks or in the Golani infantry unit, because in the end, this is really about advancing a feminist agenda. So expressing this concern that, allowing women, encouraging women in these new roles has much broader implications. And whether or not one agrees that a woman in a tank is part of the feminist agenda, it's certainly seen by some as advancing causes well beyond sort of defense needs. So can you tell us a little more about what are the concerns alleged by rabbis, and what is the sort of what authority or not do they have in weighing in?
So I'll start from the end. Usually the assumption is that rabbis have a lot of say in the idea. So that's usually the assumption, but you can understand from my body language that it's not necessarily true. But it is certainly something that's out there and something that's in public discourse, and it's used. But also, sort of following what you're saying, integrating women in the military is first and foremost a political issue. And most people, depends on what side of this political issue you stand, is how you really look at things. But before we go into that, I'll say something very general. And that is that my husband served in the reserve for many years. And when you put a 45-year-old in combat together with an 18-year-old, there are going to be discrepancies. And it's very obvious who is the better soldier. And when you're in your 40s and you're supposed to do reserve duty and you're sleeping in the field and you're complaining about your back hurting and that it's very hard to take all this stuff on your back, you're not an ideal soldier. So why do we conscript? Why do we call to the reserves 45-year-olds? And there are older men who also do reserve duty. So why do we do it? Because having someone in the reserves has its own incentives, its own assets. There is something to be said for an older soldier from many different perspectives. So we don't only have people in the military because of their physical ability. We have people in the military for a range of ability. And that's something I think that should be on the table, because when you conscript women, and when you have women in various different roles in the IDF, they're not only there because they can run or do push-ups or carry. They also have other assets that the military can use. And in today's military, the 21st century, where it's not all about your muscles, there is something to be said for other assets that different kinds of soldiers bring to the table. And this is all, again, also true for many men who are not Rambo. And most soldiers are not Rambo. The other thing to say is that when you take the typical crack reconnaissance Israeli soldier and you stand him next to the same role in the Swedish army, you're going to get a completely different physique. And it doesn't mean that because the typical Israeli man is built differently than the typical Swedish man, it doesn't make him less of a soldier. It doesn't mean that he's not as good a soldier. It means he's a different soldier and he brings different value to the table. So that's something that I think that we should say before we embark on this, the issue of having women in combat in general. So again, as we said, what happens if a woman can't load the cannon properly? And what happens if she's going to be a prisoner of war? And all these more functional considerations are all there. When rabbis discuss this, they're trying many times to say that their considerations are not only religious, that they're really looking out for the good of the IDF. It should be, as you said, a good force. It should be able to perform well on the battlefield. And they're only looking out for the military's best interest. They're also only looking out for the women's best interest, because physically, it's not good for a woman to pick up heavy things and to run a lot and to carry more than her body weight. And those are all things that are very detrimental to her health. So they're only looking out for the military's health, for military capabilities, and for women's health. On the other hand, there are religious considerations, and they can't be ignored, because religion, first of all, frowns upon women on the battlefield. Women are not supposed to be there. They're supposed to be at home. Women are also supposed to not be in close proximity with men they're not married to, or are not related, first-degree relations with men. On the other hand, young men are also not supposed to be in close proximity with women, especially women they're not related to, especially not when they're 18 and unmarried themselves, because this causes the military camp to be an immoral place. And again, we're looking at this through a religious prism. And in this, rabbis are no different, I would say, from any other religious authority, because these are the sort of things religion does not like. Religion frowns upon premarital sex, and having close proximity with young people, you know that that's what you're going to get. So we're against it. That's something not good. The other thing that's important to remember is that since we're conscripting and we have young men and women together, some of these young men and women did not grow up in mixed society. They don't know how to talk to women, or they don't know how to interact with men. They've studied in separate high schools. Some of them go to separate youth movements. They don't know women from outside their family. So it is sort of a shock to then serve in, if we're talking about a mixed tank, to be in a mixed tank together will be uncomfortable for both sides. So it's not that the rabbis are completely exaggerating the situation. A lot of young men and women in these ages really do feel uncomfortable serving with the opposite sex in close proximity. All that said, in the article that you quoted before, I used the focus group, and I asked young men who served in combat roles and non-combat roles how they felt about serving with women. So one of the very interesting findings, and I made sure today to speak to a number of informants to make sure that what I was going to say now is still on par. And most combat soldiers meet very few women during their service. So if you are a run-of-the-mill regular combat soldier, the amount of women that you're going to encounter during your service is very small. You'll meet a shooting instructor, you'll perhaps meet medics, you'll meet the NCO dealing with your social, how your family, is there food in your fridge? If you're in the tank corps, you'll meet a tank instructor or mortar instructor. There are certain courses that you'll have that a woman will be your instructor. But in general, you'll serve with men, and that's who you'll have. So when rabbis complain about women in combat, they're not really talking about women in combat. They're actually talking about something else. On the other hand, if you serve in intelligence, you're going to serve with a lot of women, and you're going to be in close proximity with them pretty much all of your service. But nobody talks about these men. So when you talk to combat soldiers and non-combat soldiers who are religious, usually the combat soldiers will tell you that their encounters with women are pretty normal. It's like what they assume that they'll encounter later on in life when they have a normal job or when they go to university. And for many of them, it's not different from what they experienced when they were in high school. Many of them go to concerts where they'll pay tickets to listen to a woman sing. They listen to women on the radio. This isn't a real problem that they have. There are soldiers who do, but if we're looking at most of them do not have these problems. Whereas in intelligence, they're serving together all the time. And one of the most important things that one of the members of my focus group talked about was how his rabbis viewed the fact that he was serving with women in intelligence. First of all, the rabbis really, most of my informants who came from these non-combat roles said that no one really discussed this with them. What would it be like to serve with women all of the time? What would it be like to be on night duty, which basically means that you're 8 hours with one other person in the room, and she happens to be a girl. And you don't normally talk to girls, certainly not for 8 hours straight when you're working in the same room together. And this was something that wasn't discussed by their rabbis. Or probably the most interesting thing that one of them recounted was that his rabbi told him that when he goes to the mess, he should sit with the girls and not sit with the men, because the men speak about immodest topics. They're going to talk about their weekends with their girlfriends, and there's a lot of profanity. So his rabbi said, sit with the girls, because the girls aren't talking about topics that are considered problematic religiously. They're much better behaved. They're nicer, and they don't swear as much. So sit with the girls. It'll be better for you morally to be in that situation. So this is actually something that we don't usually hear about when we talk about rabbis in the military and how they view women and how they view their women together with men.
This is so interesting and brings up so many different paths. I want to just kind of, I guess, center on a couple for a moment. One is that, of course, like within this category of religion, as you kind of suggested, there's a range, right? Like there's of these soldiers, and your first book, which maybe is here, see, people can see. Anyways, is really looking at religious student soldiers, particularly men, and again, but even there, like a range, some of them, as you're saying, coming from totally single sex, like they have only been in homosocial spaces, and then they get to the military and it's potentially, but not necessarily different. But some of them also have lived lives where they've been, interacting with women, if not, not just at home, but like, maybe in at least some parts of school or youth groups or other spaces where are going to, social events, concerts and whatnot. So, there's, a range of perspectives, and kind of to deepen that a bit, can you talk about kind of then, right, for some of them, they enter these spaces, and as you're saying, they're either, it's like not such a big deal, or they're even encouraged to talk to the women. And for others, it's like, whoa. And for those for whom this is potentially profoundly disconcerting or uncomfortable, they often sometimes then request some kinds of accommodations. So can you talk a little bit about what are the types of accommodations that some people request, and how the military perceives that? What do they do? What do they give? What do they resist? How do they grapple with kind of a religious request rather than some other kind?
So this is a really very important topic. The IDF really would like to accommodate for lots of different reasons. And some of them are internal and some of them are external, but the IDF is very motivated to accommodate religious soldiers, both men and women. And for quite a long time already, there is in place what is called the proper integration, hashiluv hara'ui, which sort of lays down guidelines for what is allowed and what is not allowed, but it's basically to create safe spaces for both men and women, not only religious soldiers, but we all know that many times women would like to have sort of a safe space. So, of course, there's no allowance for men and women sleeping in the same room, although this does happen. But according to the guidelines, it's not allowed. Say you're in a medics course, and in a medics course, there is a lot of, or we'll talk about shooting, because shooting everyone does. So when part of training, there is a shooting instructor, and usually these instructors are women. When it comes time for the instructor to actually touch you and make sure that you're in the right position, soldiers will be asked if they prefer to not be touched by a woman. Shmirat negi'ah, there's a whole category, halachic category as far as that's concerned. And the soldiers will be asked, who of you observes this and who does not? And those who observe shmirat negi'ah, they will not touch someone of the opposite sex. This is true for women as well. Women who do not say want to shake hands with a man. That's also, it works both ways. So they will have a male shooting instructor who will take care of this group. And this is true for many other circumstances as well. For Haredi soldiers, ultra-Orthodox soldiers, no women are involved in their training in any way. And they even have the non-commissioned officer who takes care of their social aspects is also a man. So you'll have, say, in a course of Mashaki Otash, women who are NCO sort of social workers, there'll be 100 women and 2 men who will, so that they'll be able to take care of the men who do not want to have anything to do with the women for religious reasons. So it is possible to accommodate them. The other thing, the other category, of course, is dress. How should everyone dress, say, when they're doing, when they're exercising? Because in the morning, everyone's exercising. What are you allowed to wear? What are you not allowed to wear? Are you allowed to leave your room attired in shorts and I don't know, an undershirt? Or do you have to wear more than that? So there are certain guidelines to make sure that everyone feels comfortable. In the officers course, there are integrated units and segregated units. You can be in an all women's team or an all men's team. You can request this sort of thing. But what many times happens is that the IDF is so worried that someone will be offended that sometimes they go overboard. So you hear lots of stories of women being punished because they hugged each other in public, because you're not supposed to show any sign of affection in public. But these are instances where the system is so afraid of someone feeling uncomfortable that they go overboard, when it doesn't necessarily affect the soldiers that they're trying to protect. On the other hand, there are also instances where the proper introduction is not upheld. And for instance, a few years ago, there was a scandal because reserve soldiers were sleeping in the field, and the women who were part of the support convoy that was with them were also sleeping in the same area. And that's wrong. And they complained, and there was a whole issue around that. So it goes both ways. In general, it's not fun to be religious in the military. I think that's the rule of thumb. It is not like being at home. It's not like when you're a civilian where you can abstain from certain things. It's not a picnic. Many of my informants also in the book and also later on use this exact terminology. It's no picnic being religious in the military. But it's not a picnic to be a vegetarian in the military either, or to be vegan, or many other things. If you have an allergy, it's also difficult because the military is not accommodating for for individuals. The military looks at you as part of the group. So there are certain places where you can be accommodated and certain places where you can't be accommodated. And I think that's basically the basis where we have to progress from. But it is possible to be an observant young man and come into minimal contact with women during your military service. Now, you talked about the men who are on the other side, and they're observant, but they don't necessarily feel uncomfortable with women because they grew up with women. They were in the same youth group. 2 weeks ago, there was a concert given by Bar-Ilan. 2 weeks ago, maybe it was more. I don't remember. You should remember because we talked about it afterwards. She is an Israeli pop star, and she was in the military, and part of her military service was to give concerts in the military itself. So on the day before she was discharged, she gave a concert, and many of the soldiers in the audience were religious soldiers who come from a very religious setting. They were Hesder Yeshiva students, which means that they integrate their religious studies together with military service. And many times they're more stringent in everything to do with women, but a lot of them would listen to her if she was on the radio, but they didn't feel like being in the concert. So they said that they don't listen to women who sing, and they were outside. And it's okay, according to military protocol. They weren't doing something wrong, but they weren't doing it because they didn't want to hear her. They were doing it because they wanted to talk to their girlfriend on the phone, which sort of clashes. This isn't everyone, of course, because again, we're talking about a range of religious observances, and different people react differently. So some of them really didn't want to hear her because of the prohibition of hearing women sing. But some of them are 18 and 19-year-olds who do what they want when they're in the military situation, and they wanted the free time, so they took it. Now, there's another consideration, and that is that many times these men and women feel pressure to represent their sector in society. So I might not observe these things in my civilian life, but now that I'm in the military, I feel that I have to represent my social group. So I will be more stringent in my observance because I feel that I'm representing something. So these are sort of the three categories that we would look at.
Wonderful, thank you. And I think it gets, this last point gets really interesting, the way in which religion can be sword or shield for different people in different moments and kind of wielded in different ways, depending on both kind of the knowledge of these intersecting institutions and these intersecting spaces, and what people's goals in a particular moment are. And religion can be helpful, it can hinder. And I'm going to ask one last question before getting into some of our audience questions. But one thing that's always a point of tension in discussions about the United States military is the argument about it being basically a social experiment. Now, I'll put my cards on the table. I absolutely view the U.S. military as a space of social experiment, where there have been all sorts of policies that often are ahead of American society. For example, desegregating the armed forces before, say, schools were desegregated in the United States. The military is not always ahead. Sometimes it lags behind, but it goes in both ways. But it is a space where it's a hierarchical organization, and therefore there are policies that can be enforced. And I'm curious around gender and around religion. Do you think the Israeli military is a space of, an experimental space, a social experiment, if you will, or not? And is it perceived? How is it perceived in society? Is it understood to be the vanguard or needing to kind of move slowly?
So I think one of the things that struck me when I read your book was how really in the American military, that's more the way it is, whereas in the Israeli military, it's, I think, very different in that aspect. So if, again, in the American experience, it's sort of something that comes from the top, and something that we're trying to make these people understand, so that when they go back to society, they will behave differently or understand things differently. Regarding religion, it's more a bottom-up process in the IDF. Not to say that the IDF doesn't have an aspect of social experimentation, it does. But I think that in this case, it's less so. And that the military is really more, I won't say afraid, but apprehensive about what will happen if it doesn't accept social norms regarding religion. And the other thing that's important to remember as far as Israeli society is concerned is that Israeli society is very traditional. I think in many ways it's more traditional than American society. And it's a tendency that's just growing. So if secularization was something that was stronger once upon a time, it's weakening in Israeli society. And I think there's a lot of scholarship about that, and we could really talk about that tendency all the time. So if we're looking sort of as, is the military able to educate and change social perceptions of religion, that's something that's more an American experience and less an Israeli experience. Really, what happens is the IDF is more reacting and less initiating. You can say positive and negative things about it. In other ways, or in the aspects, say, of gender integration, I think the military is responding and trying sometimes to educate, but I'm not sure that it's so successful in that, because the military is a very masculine system, and it doesn't like women. And it's also not, I'm looking for the word. It doesn't like change. It doesn't want to change. And integrating women forces change. There's nothing you can do about it. So say the Air Force was really the first place where the IDF was forced to change, because it was forced to accept women in the famous Supreme Court, Alice Miller initiated, a case that Alice Miller initiated. But once the Air Force was forced to change, the rest of the military said, oh, wait a minute, we have to do something here. And they changed. The Navy changed without being forced to change because they realized that if they didn't react on their own, someone was going to force them to react. So the military doesn't like change in general. And it integrates and it does make an effort. And I think that it understands that if it wants to remain relevant and if it wants conscription to remain in place, it's going to have to change. But it's not happy about it. And it certainly doesn't, it's not in the way that we would see in the American military.
So to follow up on that, we have a question about kind of really just the past 10 years, and we focus on the past 10 years, how, especially in the realm of gender and the roles of women have changed, and whether that, from your perspective, is trend setting from a global perspective. So there's how the military relates to Israeli society, but then there's also how the Israeli military relates to other worldwide militaries. And so particularly on the question of women in the military, to what degree is what's happening in Israel ahead or not of what's happening in other places?
So I think that if you look at other places, say in Scandinavia, there's a lot more going on as far as gender equality is concerned in the military. Wow, there's a lot of interesting things going on in Scandinavia. Not necessarily relevant to the Israeli experience, because the real problem to, say, breaking out of traditional military roles is going to be religion, because, say, in Scandinavia, the religious considerations are not as strong and not as problematic. And even though religious considerations are political, some of them really do exist. And in order to make, we have to remember that since the Israeli military is a conscription-based military, there's a limit to what you can force people to do. So if you're not conscripting them and people are volunteering, then you can do a lot. You can force them to do many things. But once it's not a voluntary force, there is a limit to what you can do. So I would say that there are some people in the military in Israel who are looking towards, say, Scandinavia and saying, look how wonderful gender integration is there. What can we also do here? But there are limitations. Is Israel trendsetting? Well, Israel loves to portray itself as, look at all these girls with guns, and if you look in Google images for Israeli soldier female, you'll get great pictures, very, very photogenic. But in practice, I think that what we usually don't look at is that where women are making the most impact is not the women in the tanks, but the women in intelligence corps, the women in cyber, and getting, we aren't really able as the public to see these impacts, but women are doing a lot in settings that we don't necessarily view as masculine and military. So actually looking at, every so often there is an interview with some woman who's very high ranked in cyber activities in the IDF, which is always very, very interesting. And then they go on to do very important things in civilian world as well.
Yeah, so right, like there are all these roles that aren't necessarily the public face of women's service, but actually women are playing essential roles in just kind of these more and gets at kind of these intentionally behind the scenes roles, like, intelligence and cyber are spaces where you don't want sort of them to be the face of it. And I guess then to follow up on that, a really great question about the rise of, in particular, Orthodox Jewish women enlisting, because as you mentioned earlier, like women could choose national service. There are alternatives, but that there has been growth of Orthodox women serving in the IDF specifically. And what does that tell us both about Israeli society broadly, but also more specifically about the religious Zionist world, and how do we think about the women in the military in that particular religious and political space?
So wow, that's such a great question. I could have planted it myself. Okay, so I said in the beginning that when the rabbis discuss or oppose having women in combat, that really they're talking to a different audience. And really the audience that they're talking to are religious women. Because as the question said, and this is a trend that is just growing stronger all the time, more and more religious women are enlisted. Now, it's not that religious women didn't enlist, because religious women always enlisted. It just wasn't as visible as, say, in the last 2 decades. And sort of the last bastion that rabbis are fighting to preserve is to, if you're going to be a soldier, at least don't go to combat. Do something that's more befitting a good Jewish girl. So don't go to combat. So sort of drawing the line in the sand on combat is hopefully when rabbis are speaking to their students and saying, women shouldn't be in combat, it's terrible. Feminists are trying to undermine the idea of being ready for battle. They're really speaking to these young men's sisters and telling them, when you want to enlist in the military, you're doing a disservice, like the quote that you read before. You're doing something that's only going to be detrimental to the state. And therefore, you should go to national service, because they realize that more and more women are understanding that they can serve in the IDF and that it won't reflect badly upon them. It used to be that if a religious woman served in the IDF, it meant that she was less religious. It meant that she wouldn't find a nice Jewish boy who would marry her. It meant that there was something wrong with her upbringing. This isn't true for everyone, but there were social implications for someone serving in the military. But today, those social implications are not as strong. And it's possible to be a very good Jewish girl and still serve in the IDF and find a nice Jewish boy who will marry you. And no one will go up to your parents in the synagogue and say, oh, your daughter is doing a terrible thing because she's serving in the military. What is the last thing that we can maybe hold over their heads so that they won't want to enlist? And that's the issue of combat. Don't, if you're going to be in intelligence, or you're going to be in the educational corps, those are roles that are befitting, and it's okay, and we're willing to accept that. Most of these rabbis are not going to say that it's allowed halachically, but at least they won't say that it's prohibited and you're sinning and you're a terrible person, or at least they won't say it to your face, which is something that used to be once upon a time. So combat really is something that's portrayed as the last terrible sin that you can commit if you're a religious woman who wants to serve. I think that most of these young women, or again, it depends on where they've studied and where they've grown up, but very, very slowly, even in the more stringent areas of religious Zionism, women are enlisting, and they think that they will be fulfilling themselves more if they serve in the military than in national service. On the other hand, and this is actually a very new study that was just published, not mine, but very, very interesting, that national service is understanding that they have to portray themselves in a better way in order to get good women power to come and serve with them. And what they do is they have like these days where they'll invite the girls to come, and agencies who want to recruit them, including government agencies, including places like the Mossad, or I forgot what it's called in English, where say the Biological Institute in Nes Ziona, which works on it's also science very high tech, yeah, and science research, but science research that has a security aspect to it. And they try to recruit bright young women who are religious and show them that even if they go to national service, they won't be doing pink collar work. They'll be doing very important work that contributes to the defense of the state, and it's not any different from if they served in the intelligence corps, and actually better. The other thing that national service has been doing, in recent years, it's been uncovered that although the religious establishment would like to show that in the IDF there are more instances of sexual assault and that women are more vulnerable in the military system, it's actually the opposite. That in national service, there have been more really horrible instances of sexual assault and harassment, and that the entire system of national service was not able to protect women. So they've really sort of reorganized in order to address this issue much, much better. The military had this happen, say, 15 years ago, and now national service is also doing it as well. So all of this is sort of trying to move religious women who have been going more to the IDF back to national civil service, which is very interesting.
Absolutely. And it gets into these questions of roles. So like one way of framing these discussions and debates is about the opportunities for women and what they create both in the short term and long term. And as you mentioned, kind of potential concerns over kind of pink collar jobs or being relegated to specific roles that may not have the same level of opportunities. And then there's also, and we have a good question about this, about, as there are more Orthodox soldiers who are invested in gender segregation, does it also then limit the roles of women? Like what's kind of the opposite side here of that religious accommodations aren't always neutral in their impact? So, are there ways in which the military's effort to accommodate, as hard as it may be to be religious in this space, are there ways in which the accommodation efforts also circumscribe opportunities? And how do you see that kind of, where are the debates on that? Where do they stand? And what's the sort of the implications between military and civilian worlds for kind of the role of accommodations?
So again, the military is not a very liberal space in general. It just isn't. And I don't think that we're ever going to be able to, we civilian society are ever going to be able to force the military to become liberal. It just isn't. It isn't. So for the military, it is very helpful to sort of hide behind religious accommodation in order to do what it wants to do. You are not going to find generals who are going to say, yes, it's a wonderful idea to put women in tanks. It's a wonderful idea to put women in the infantry. We think this is terrific. And I think it's also unfair to expect something like this from them, because the way the system is structured, it's just not conducive to this. And we can say lots of things about it, but it's, when I look at it, we like to blame the military for a lot of things that are really our fault as a society. And especially in the IDF, which is a conscription military, it mirrors Israeli society. So what you see in society is what you're going to get in the military. And until society changes, the military is not going to change either. The military in this respect, and as I said before, is usually the last place where these things change. And they change because the military is forced to toe the line that the civilian sphere tells it to. In this, if we're talking about this. So I think that expecting the military to sort of rise up and offer opportunities is unrealistic. Does it hide behind religious considerations? Sure, because it's wonderful. The military can say, I can't do this because of the rights of religious soldiers, and they can exploit it. And it can be true, it can be not true, But it's very easy for the military to utilize this as something that allows it to remain where in its comfort zone. And as a civilian, I really have nothing to say to this, because there are also operational considerations. You want the military to win. You want the military to be strong. So when they hide behind these things as civilians, it's always very hard for us to say, oh, this isn't true, because the military can always say you don't have the expertise to judge. Although at times the Supreme Court has said to the IDF, this is all very well and good, but you can't do this because we are a democratic society and we decide how you appoint your officers, or that you must allow women to be allowed to apply to a pilot's course. So it's sort of a fine balance. But yes, many times religious considerations are not true. Sometimes they are, but sometimes they're not. And again, we return to the point where it's political, and it depends what side you're on.
It's really interesting to hear about the role also then of the courts in all of this. And I'm thinking about this specifically because in the US over about the past 40 years, there's been extraordinary deference by courts to the military for reasons you say, right? Because the military says combat readiness or efficiency, and there's just like sort of this automatic deference. But what's been really interesting on the religion side in the US is we've had a radical shift, whereas like in the mid 1980s, the Supreme Court was like, we're going to defer to the military. And so like the Air Force psychologist wearing a kippah, and the military says that gets, grooming standards, it's a problem. No, you're not wearing it. It's out of uniform. Well, what can we do but defer to the military, right? And then Congress passes some laws. They deal with that particular issue. But literally just yesterday, the Fifth Circuit Court said, actually, when it comes to COVID vaccines, we're not going to defer to the Navy SEALs who say we want everyone to be vaccinated, and that's what will make you ready to deploy. Suddenly, religion became well, if they have a religious reason not to be vaccinated, the military, we're not going to defer to what the military says. So like a really interesting pivot, but also getting at what you're saying, sometimes the use of religion becomes is helpful for the military when it wants to enforce certain processes or standards, and at other times it really does get in the way. But I guess, is the trend line though in Israel about kind of the courts deferring or not deferring? Like, can you speak a little to kind of that relationship?
So I think we're talking about gender equality and the whole issue of religion. So the courts, in many, many cases, have forced the military to do things it didn't want to do, and said, no, it's not about battle readiness. So I think one of we talked about the Alice Miller court case, which is always seen as a watershed. But the Galili case, which is in the 1990s, a very high-ranking officer was accused of conduct unbecoming, not completely sexual harassment, but more or less. And after he was convicted within a military setting, a few years later, they wanted to promote him to a much, much higher, high-ranking job. And the woman in question filed a suit against him in the Supreme Court. And she won. And one of the interesting things in the Galili case is that I forgot who wrote Tova Strasser-Cohen, who was I think she was the head of I lost the word, the group of judges who sat on this case in the Supreme Court, said that she understands from what the military is saying that he is very gifted and he's an important commander, and that the military really, really needs him to be in a high-ranking position. But she said, I cannot imagine that there is only one person who can take this role. And we have a duty to our civilian citizens who send their children to the military. So again, we have the issue of conscription here. We as a society are giving you the military, our most precious commodity, our children. and we expect you to take care of them. And part of this civil contract between Israeli society and the military dictates that there are certain things that the military cannot do. And they cannot have someone convicted of conduct unbecoming in the sexual assault category. They can't have him as a high-ranking officer, no matter how talented he is. Even if he were Napoleon, she didn't say that. But she said, no matter how gifted he is, this is something that we can't allow. So in many security cases, the court does defer to the military. But in these cases, in cases of equality and gender segregation, in many times the court is able to say, no, this is something that you can't do. Something that maybe is interesting in the same but different. A number of years ago, two soldiers who had to sign on, they were recruited for a technical job, and they had to sign on extra for this. But as their service progressed, they didn't want to sign on extra, and they sued the military in labor court, saying that it was unfair to have them sign something when they were 18 and didn't understand what they were signing, and then bind them to this for so many years. They lost their case, but the court did say that the IDF has to change their recruiting policy, that they can't continue to do what they've been doing. So in this case, there's also, it sort of is different, but it's not, because the army really did have to change.
Wow, that's really fascinating. And to think about, the longer term shifts then about how the military recruits and portrays what you're in fact signing up for. We're getting close to the end, but I want to ask one last question, which is, we've talked a lot about gender roles, and that's gotten, and obviously the intersection of religion and gender. Lingering over gender, I think, is often sex and sexuality. And I'm curious, we had a question from the audience about IDF policies around gay and lesbian soldiers, and about pregnancy, about other facets of life, but particularly around sexuality, which is often prompted by concerns about kind of women in these spaces. But of course, concerns about homosexuality are often, about men. So if you could just talk a little bit about sexuality and policies in the IDF and how that's been handled, and whether that's elicited religious concerns as well.
Okay, so that's huge. We're never going to be able to talk about that in 2 minutes. So something that a lot of religious soldiers talk about is that in the places where there are integrated units, Israel has a number of combat units where men and women serve together in combat, Karakal, Bar-Ilan. So conventional lore has it that they sell condoms in the, I don't know the American term for the shekim. Maybe someone can help me here. The canteen.
The PX,
canteen. And they're always out in these units. They're always out of condoms because everyone buys them up all the time, and so that's something that religious soldiers say a lot. Like, why is it not good to serve? And because there's a lot of sexuality in the open going on there. I don't know how much really go into sort of same-sex situations, but I'll say something maybe more general. In the past few years, there have been different sort of popular culture representation of gay and lesbian soldiers, more than I think that we've seen in the past. One of the most interesting instances was a sort of, I guess you can say it's a drama, a series that was on, it had two seasons, about a medical team. And so it's in the army, and a lot of the things going on there are sort of semi-military, but a lot of it is about relationships within the team. And there are a lot of same-sex relationships there, and people who are bi, and back and forth. And it was what struck me, my kids watched it. And they were very into it, even though the military side wasn't as important to them as what was going on. But it was very matter of fact, very natural that these things were happening. I think maybe that says a lot about Israeli society and also about the idea.
Well, that was awesome.
Yeah, and TV Recs are always welcome.
TV Recs are always, wait, what's the name of the series?
Now I have to remember.
We'll look it up.
Why can't I remember it?
We can always look it up. It's my pleasure and delight to thank you, Ronit, and to thank you, Elisheva, for a wonderful conversation, and to thank our audience for joining us and throwing in their questions. I learned a tremendous amount. Less about popular media and more about
Tagad. I'm sorry, I remember. Tagad.
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 Okay. Tagad. Okay, we'll look it up. So thank you both of that for making us think about some important and difficult issues. And I'd like to flag again that one can find our recorded programs for this semester and prior semesters up on the Helen Diller Institute website. The link again is right now appearing in the chat. And that's all from us. I hope you have a lovely rest of the spring. And thank you also for our technical team and for everybody at the Institute for making this event so easy and accessible. That's all for me.